Loras Tyrell stood on the ramparts of Highgarden with the golden dusk at his back, watching the wind stir the banners of the Golden Rose. Memories of Renly Baratheon's laughter haunted him in that tranquil moment, and he felt a great pang in his heart. In the distance, the Mander glittered beneath the last rays of the sun, carrying merchant ships and fishing vessels toward the summer seas. The breeze that drifted across the parapets was gentle, smelling of roses and sweet summer grasses, so different from the chill and gloom that hovered about Storm's End during the final days of Renly's life. It was there, in Renly's tent on that grim, starless night, that a shadow in the likeness of Stannis Baratheon had torn Renly's life away. Loras had carried that pain ever since, pressed against his heart like a dagger. He had served as King Renly's sworn shield, had pledged himself entirely, body and soul, to that charismatic lord who had worn a crown of golden antlers and dreamt of uniting the realm under a kinder, more chivalrous rule. But all those dreams were snuffed out in a swirl of unearthly darkness, leaving only heartbreak and an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. For a time, Loras had cast that thirst aside, directing his sword arm in service of the Tyrell alliance with the Lannisters. After Renly's death, the Tyrells had turned to the Lannisters at King's Landing, offering Margaery's hand to King Joffrey to ensure their family's rise. Loras, grief-stricken, had thrown himself into battles and tournaments, earning the name the Knight of Flowers more from memory than from fresh accolades. He wore his white cloak as a Kingsguard to Joffrey Baratheon, a duty that once might have been an honor, but for him was simply a means to bury his past behind feigned loyalty. Yet the ache never left him. The ghost of Renly's smile would come unbidden in the quiet of the night, the memory of his voice in the hush of the morning. And there remained the face of Stannis Baratheon, stark and austere, who claimed the murder was not his doing and yet had pressed forward relentlessly, forging alliances with the darkness that had taken Renly's life. Loras never truly believed that Stannis was an innocent bystander to that sorcery. He had sworn that one day he would repay every ounce of sorrow. Night after night in the Red Keep, Loras wondered if his vow was an act of folly. Stannis was far away, entrenched in the thick wilderness of the north or marching across the storm-lashed coastlines, fighting to keep his cause alive. But news traveled. Stannis was neither dead nor broken. He fought on despite defeats, forging ahead in the name of his rights. And then came a strange rumor whispered through the corridors of the Red Keep. Stannis Baratheon was contemplating a march south once more. The possibility of confronting him reawakened that vengeance in Loras's chest, setting his heart alight. The turning point came when Margaery's influence over the Lannisters, particularly over the young King Tommen, who had inherited the throne after Joffrey's death, rose to a pinnacle. Ser Jaime Lannister wore the white cloak as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and he could not help but notice that Loras Tyrell's fervor had returned, though he could not guess fully why. Margaery and Lady Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, commanded an ever larger share of the royal court's ear. So it was that the Tyrells, guided by a mixture of ambition and pride, found themselves in a position of overwhelming influence at King's Landing. Lady Olenna offered cunning counsel, Mace Tyrell commanded men and coin, and the fair Margaery Tyrell had ensnared the Boy King with all her charms. In the shadows behind them, Loras allowed that old hatred to harden his resolve. Even as he served as Kingsguard, Loras would train at dawn and twilight with an almost savage intensity, driving his sword against straw men until his muscles quivered and sweat drenched his tunic. The courtyard would echo with the crack of steel on wood. At times, he would whisper, "For Renly," before delivering the final blow to the practiced dummy. His fellow knights, Ser Balon Swan, Ser Meryn Trant, even Ser Jaime Lannister, would watch with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. None suspected just how deep that obsession ran. When word reached King's Landing that Stannis had set sail for the Stormlands again, a quiet hush fell over the Red Keep. King Tommen was but a boy, barely in the first flush of adolescence. The Lannisters worried that Dorne might rise against them, or that the North might swear itself anew to a stark pretender. Now, with Stannis' landing in the Stormlands, that old threat had returned. Loras Tyrell joined the High Councils, standing behind the dais with one hand on the pommel of his sword as his father, Mace Tyrell, declared that House Tyrell would not stand idle while Stannis tried to reclaim the seat of House Baratheon, Storm's End, and muster more lords to his cause. Lady Olenna's sharp voice had cut through the council. "We'll keep him from the Stormlands. Mark my words. If Stannis Baratheon sets foot in Storm's End once more, he shall wish he had never crawled from his island fortress." And so the plan was set. The Tyrell forces, joined by what remained of the Crown's men, would march or sail to Storm's End to meet Stannis head-on. In the hall, Loras inclined his head, quietly voicing his full agreement, anticipating the clash to come with grim satisfaction. Yet it was the Queen of Thorns who pulled him aside later, beckoning him to follow her through the corridors until they reached a secluded balcony overlooking the city. Lady Olenna was no fool, and it did not take her long to decipher the wariness in Loras's eyes. She regarded her grandson with an air of measured concern, tapping her cane lightly against the marble floor. She told him that it was good strategy for the Tyrells to break Stannis's ambition once and for all. A renewed war in the Stormlands could provoke other lords to raise their banners in rebellion, plunging the realm into further chaos. "But be wary, my sweet boy," she said in a hushed tone, her eyes sharper than glass. "Do not let the thirst for vengeance overshadow your reason. We are on the cusp of greatness here, if we manage things carefully." Loras in that moment bristled. His grandmother's words seemed to urge caution, but he could not hide the desire that had festered in him since Renly's death. "He must pay," Loras whispered, voice trembling with a vehemence that he rarely allowed to surface. "He killed my king, He nearly said my love, but swallowed the words. Even with his grandmother, perhaps especially with his grandmother, he had learned to be guarded." "He did," Lady Olenna agreed, with uncharacteristic softness, though her tone remained edged. "And you shall have justice, I'm certain. Just remember, the greatest vengeance is not always the slash of a sword. Sometimes it's seizing the power they coveted and eclipsing their legacy with our own." She left him with that thought, tapping her cane against the floor and walking away. Loras remained on the balcony, his white cloak stirring behind him. He gazed out over the city's sprawl, the waters of Blackwater Bay shimmering in the distance, and he considered how many times Renly had dreamed of wearing a crown. A kinder, more beloved king, that was the vision Renly had cherished. The Iron Throne had slipped from his grasp, but maybe, just maybe, House Tyrell could pick up that dream. Could Loras himself make it a reality? The notion seemed outlandish, even blasphemous, but that seed, once planted, began to grow. After all, why serve a boy king manipulated by the Lannisters, whose hold on the throne came from a questionable lineage? Had not Renly and Margaery once dreamed of a union that would place the Rose upon the realm's greatest seat of power? Loras shut his eyes. He could almost picture it. The banners of House Tyrell adorning the Red Keep, the common folk kneeling to a king or queen of the Reach, the abundance of harvest feeding the realm, instead of petty tyrants forcing the poor into starvation and war. If only Renly had lived to see it. But Loras was alive. Margaery was alive. House Tyrell was ascendant, with allies enough to challenge even the Lannisters if it came to that. It was on that balcony that Loras Tyrell hardened his heart further and planned the first steps of his own quiet rebellion. He would go to Storm's End with permission from King Tommen's hand, his father Mace Tyrell, or the Boy King's council, feigning loyalty and determination to defend the realm. But in truth, he would ride for his own cause. Stannis was the first obstacle. Stannis had to fall, not merely defeated in battle, but shattered in such a way that the realm could no longer rally around his name. Then would come the next steps, forging the Tyrell path to the Iron Throne. When the Tyrell host mustered at the city gates, Loras led a contingent of knights in gleaming armor, the golden roses of Highgarden emblazoned on their surcoats. The boy king stood upon a dais, escorted by his Kingsguard, to see them off. Margaery stood at his side, lovely as a spring dawn, offering sweet words of farewell and devotion to the men. Trumpets blared, the cheers of small folk echoed, and for a moment, all seemed bright and eager for the conflict ahead. The Lannisters had their own captains in the ranks as well, though not as numerous. King Tommen waved timidly, Mace Tyrell made a grand show of bowing to the king, proclaiming that the Tyrell name would stand loyal to the crown through every storm. Loras bowed as well, face concealed by his helm, though beneath the steel his eyes were cold. He remembered the taste of bitterness standing in a field once, as Renly introduced him to banners from the Reach, promising a bright future. Now he rode to war again, but the star he followed was not the image of Renly, shining with confidence. It was a darker, lonelier star, a star lit by revenge and ambition. They traveled swiftly down the Rose Road, the long lines of cavalry and foot soldiers winding their way through fertile plains. The men of the Reach were well provisioned, and wagons carrying food and supplies rolled behind them. Loras made certain to ride near the vanguard, ignoring the typical camaraderie of a military camp. The other knights saw him as a figure of legendary skill, a man once famed in tournaments, now quietly intense. Some whispered that the Knight of Flowers had been changed by grief, that heartbreak had honed his blade to a deadlier edge. Few dared disturb him, but all respected him. As they drew nearer to Storm's End, the weather began to shift. The skies turned gray, and cold rains battered the encampments at night. Thunder rolled in the distance, as though the Stormlands themselves were raising a voice of warning. Loras looked out on the roiling clouds each evening and thought of how the Baratheons had claimed the storm for their sigil. In the gloom of that storm-laden sky, his mind wandered back to that dreadful night, the candlelit shadows on the canvas walls of Renly's tent, the inhuman shape that snuffed out the only warmth he had truly known. At last, they reached the fringes of Storm's End, a massive fortress perched on the cliff overlooking the sea, formidable walls defying the crashing waves. Scouts confirmed that Stannis Baratheon was indeed within a day's march, leading a smaller force but bolstered by loyal lords from the Stormlands who still clung to the Baratheon name. Stannis might not have had the might he possessed before the Battle of Blackwater, but he was still a threat, and the Tyrells were determined to crush him swiftly. Under Mace Tyrell's overall command, the forces of Highgarden prepared to face Stannis in open battle. Campfires flickered under the storm-tossed sky. The ground was sodden beneath the hooves of warhorses, and a salty wind from the sea bit at the flesh. Soldiers spoke nervously of the swirling storms and of shadow magic. Loras said nothing, consumed by a personal fervor that manifested in relentless training. He gave few instructions beyond the essential. Everyone knew their roles well enough, but he kept a weather eye for any sign of the fabled Red Woman, Melisandre of Ashai, who might once more conjure terrors in the dark. Yet, on the eve of battle, it became clear through the scouts that Melisandre was not present. Rumor had it that she had sailed north months ago, or that Stannis had dismissed her or sent her away for some other purpose. Some whispered that she served a darker master, the Lord of Light, and that she might yet appear at Stannis' side in his hour of need. But for now, Stannis marched with mortal men only. This knowledge did little to quell Loras's determination. Shadow or no shadow, he would have his retribution. When dawn broke, dim and cold behind a veil of low-lying clouds, the Tyrells formed their battle lines. The cavalry under Mace Tyrell arrayed itself on one flank, while the foot and crossbowmen formed the center. Their green and gold banners whipped in the fierce wind. Stannis' men, fewer in number, took position on a rocky slope not far from the fortress. In the distance, Storm's End loomed like a silent judge. Thunder growled across the sky, as though some ancient deity was clearing its throat. Trumpets sounded, harsh and echoing in the wet air. Loras mounted his white courser, the horse's flanks shining despite the drizzle, and led the vanguard forward at a canter. He could see from afar the standard of the Flaming Heart, Stannis' sigil now combined with the crowned stag. The sight of it filled him with a surging hatred. He muttered Renly's name as he lowered the visor of his helm. The lines clashed, steel meeting steel amidst the shouts of men and the crash of hooves. Rain-slicked ground churned into mud beneath them. The Tyrell cavalry, well-mounted and disciplined, speared into the Baratheon host. Stannis' men braced with pikes and spears, but the weight of the Tyrell charge could not easily be halted. Loras rode at the forefront, his white cloak streaming behind him, sword flashing. Each blow he dealt was delivered with savage grace. He felt his arm jar with the impact of blade on shield, shield on mail, and he pressed forward, ignoring the chaos around him. In the maelstrom, he kept scanning for that one face. Men broke before him, some dropping to their knees, others rolling into the mud as their horses reared. He pressed on, urging his stallion deeper into the fray. The clang of swords and the cries of the dying battered his ears. A pike nearly unhorsed him, but he batted it aside, leaning to deliver a vicious slice that sent its wielder spinning into the mud. He was the Knight of Flowers, but there was no beauty in his swordplay now. Only deadly precision and unstoppable momentum. At last he glimpsed the crowned stag and flaming heart banner, and there, beneath that banner, Stannis Baratheon himself astride a dark horse. The man wore blackened armor, older and more battered than the last time Loras had seen him. His thick jaw was set, his pale eyes resolute. Even from a distance, Loras swore he could feel the man's iron will exuding forth. Despite being outnumbered, outflanked, and battered, Stannis still looked unyielding. A swirl of horsemen and foot soldiers parted for a moment, and Loras spurred his courser forward, ignoring the calls of those around him. Swords rose against him, but he parried and struck with lethal efficiency, forging a straight path toward Stannis. Lightning forked in the sky above as the storm's anger raged. The crash of thunder was almost immediate, a deafening roar that seemed to quake the earth. He drew near enough to see Stannis's face beneath the raised visor. The Lord of Dragonstone, self-proclaimed king in the narrow sea, locked eyes with him. Recognition dawned in Stannis's gaze, and he lifted his sword. A swirl of mounted knights came between them, but Loras twisted the reins, guiding his horse to swerve around a knot of melee. Then suddenly they were face to face, the lines of war drifting aside as though even the fates willed this confrontation to be unimpeded. Stannis was no tourney knight. He had always fought with a relentless, no-nonsense brutality. Loras swung, and Stannis's sword rose in a smooth arc to block. Steel rang upon steel, and the jolt trembled up Loras's arm. He bit down on his lip, growling, "You took Renly from me." The words were barely audible over the din, but he felt them burning in his throat. Stannis responded with a counterstrike, forcing Loras to wheel his courser sideways. "Renly was a pretender," Stannis snarled, voice grating. "He claimed the crown that was mine by rights. The rest was lost in another thunderclap. Their blades clashed again, sending sparks scattering in the gloom. Mud splattered across Loras's greaves. The Knight of Flowers pressed in fiercely, but Stannis matched him blow for blow, with a strength born of unwavering conviction. Loras tasted blood on his lip where it had split. A lesser knight might have cowered before Stannis's tenacity, but Loras used the memory of Renly's bright eyes and cunning smile like a shield against fear. Again and again, their swords met, each man seeking an opening. Horses reared and snorted, the acrid smell of sweat and iron thick in the air. Stannis hammered at Loras's shield, forcing him to shift his weight or risk falling. Loras felt his left arm tremble under the onslaught, but he rode the wave of aggression until he glimpsed an opening. With lightning reflexes, he parried a downward slash and shoved Stannis's blade wide. Then, in a blur, he drew back his sword and struck. The blow sliced across Stannis's breastplate. Sparks flew, and Stannis grunted, jerking away. His horse stumbled, mud sucking at its hooves. Loras seized the advantage, kicking his courser forward. A second blow came, aimed at Stannis's side. The older man tried to bring his shield up, but it was too slow. Loras's blade bit deep into the joint between breastplate and gorget, the narrow seam where the armor parted. Stannis lurched in the saddle, blood appearing on his throat. A swirl of immediate shock filled Stannis's eyes. He managed to rasp, "Traitor the realm." Then he slid from the saddle, collapsing into the quagmire. The war raged around them, but to Loras it was as if time stood still. He dismounted, heart pounding like a war drum, ignoring the swirl of chaos. He advanced toward Stannis, who lay on his back, struggling to breathe, the rain lashing down upon them both. The man's eyes flickered with a sudden desperation, but there was still the old Baratheon pride in them, as if he refused to concede. Loras felt a savage triumph surge in his chest, along with a hollow ache, remembering Renly's death. The final blow came almost unbidden. He thrust his sword into Stannis' chest, piercing the heart that had once burned with unwavering duty. The older man let out a ragged sigh, eyes rolling back. Loras was breathing so heavily that each gasp tore at his throat. He wrenched his sword free. A wave of exhaustion and something close to shock washed over him. Stannis Baratheon was dead, slain by his hand. The man who had stolen Renly's life, who had set them all on this dark course, was gone. And yet there was no shout of triumph in Loras's heart. There was only the storm's cold wind, the distant cries of the wounded, and the taste of salt on his lips. He lifted his gaze. Around him, the Baratheon lines were breaking. The Tyrell host pushed forward, overwhelming the remaining loyalists. One by one, knights loyal to Stannis flung down their arms or fled into the rain. Some pockets of fierce resistance remained, but it was clear the day belonged to House Tyrell. Thunder groaned once more, a dying protest to this slaughter. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the battle was over. Men called out to him, voices echoing, "Ser Loras! Ser Loras!" Some were cheering, others calling for orders. But Loras stood as if rooted, staring at the corpse of Stannis Baratheon. The old man's eyes were still open, gazing unseeingly at the roiling gray clouds. Loras wanted to say something, to cry out to the memory of Renly, to release this burden that had haunted him. But all he felt was emptiness, a sense that the final chord of a mournful song had just been played. In the days that followed, the Tyrell army took full control of Storm's End. Mace Tyrell proclaimed a triumph, parading the captured men of Stannis' host before the fortress gates. Some of the minor Stormland lords who had supported Stannis surrendered, bending the knee to King Tommen, or rather to the Tyrells, whose victory had been so decisive. Word spread across the realm that Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, had slain Stannis Baratheon in single combat, avenging Renly and securing the Stormlands for the crown. Yet amidst the celebrations, Loras could not find solace. The destruction of Stannis brought no sense of peace, only a kind of numbness. Night after night he dreamed of Renly. Sometimes he saw him smiling, beckoning him forward in a field of green grass beneath a bright summer sun. Then the dream would twist, and a shadow would cross Renly's face, snuffing him out. Loras would jolt awake, clutching at his chest, sweat cold on his brow. He had revenge, so why did the wound remain? But the wheel of power would not pause for his grief. The Tyrells had seized the Stormlands in King Tommen's name, but rumors abounded that Mace Tyrell might press for more. Lady Olenna, keen-eyed as ever, wrote letters that flew by raven to lords across Westeros, forging new alliances and coaxing uncertain houses away from any Lannister loyalty. Margaery Tyrell, seated comfortably in the Red Keep, continued to influence the king, suggesting gentle reforms that the small folk adored but which undermined the Lannister hold. The moment came unexpectedly one evening, as the Tyrell leadership gathered in the Great Hall of Storm's End, newly conquered. Loras stood to one side, restless in victory, while Mace Tyrell sat in the old seat of the Baratheons, giving audience to local lords and knights. Lady Olenna was there, too, perched like a sharp-eyed bird upon a carved chair, her gaze sweeping the hall. A matter of coin and rations for the local populace was raised, and some Stormland knights who had bent the knee were asking for the Tyrells to show mercy. Lady Olenna gave a clipped, incisive reply, reminding them that those who had followed Stannis had committed treason. Yet she also spoke of the need for unity in the realm. Loras, barely listening, recalled how Renly had once promised a gentler hand to the Stormlands. In that memory, he cleared his throat and interjected something about feeding the small folk, how they should be won with compassion. Mace Tyrell raised an eyebrow, but Lady Olenna nodded in approval. The conversation shifted to news from King's Landing. A raven had arrived bearing uncertain tidings. King Tommen's advisors were in disarray. Cersei Lannister was embroiled in fresh scandals, and the faith militant were agitating again. Margaery's hold over Tommen was strong, but so too was the animosity of the Queen Regent Cersei for all Tyrells. It seemed that at any moment, the precarious alliance could snap. Lady Olenna, in her brusque, matter-of-fact style, began to suggest that the Tyrells needed to act decisively to secure power. She spoke vaguely of a transfer of authority, alluding to the possibility that Tommen might be set aside for a more deserving monarch. The local lords looked uneasily at one another, hesitant to lend their voices to such treasonous talk. But Loras found himself transfixed by the idea. The very notion of a Tyrell upon the Iron Throne, which had once seemed so remote, now shimmered before him like an achievable goal. How many times had he dreamed that if Renly wore the crown, Margaery would be queen, and the realm would flourish. But Renly was gone. The question welled up in his mind unbidden. Why not the Tyrells themselves? Why not Margaery or Garland or even himself? As soon as the thought formed, Loras felt a deep stirring of something that was not only ambition, but also a sense of completing Renly's dream. If the realm must choose another king or queen, why not from the house that was actually beloved by the people, that held the grain and gold to feed and sustain them? Whispers became louder in the hall. Some knights insisted that King Tommen was a child and that he needed the strong guidance of House Tyrell. Others suggested that he was a Lannister puppet, that the boy had no rightful claim if indeed rumors of his parentage were true. Loras watched Lady Olenna carefully, seeing how she tested the waters, how she allowed these rumors to swirl without quite endorsing them. It was all a tapestry of manipulation she was weaving, and he sensed that he was meant to play a part in it. A hush fell when Mace Tyrell rose. He was a portly man, but there was an undeniable presence to him. He was Lord of Highgarden, Warden of the South, and father of the realm's would-be queen. He studied those assembled and made a cautious announcement that they would travel to King's Landing soon, to ensure the realm's stability. He spoke of the victory against Stannis as a sign of the Tyrells' devotion to the crown. Yet he left a subtle opening in his words, a hint that if the crown proved unworthy, House Tyrell would not falter in taking the reins. That night, Lady Olenna spoke privately with Loras in the Solar. She dismissed the guards and beckoned him near, leaning on her cane as she always did. Her gaze was shrewd, her mouth set in a thin line. "You want your vengeance complete," she said, her voice low. "You claim to have avenged Renly by killing Stannis, but is that truly enough? Renly wished to be king. If we let the Lannisters stay in power, is that not a betrayal of your beloved's dream?" Loras exhaled sharply. "Grandmother, you know I loathe the Lannisters. Joffrey was a monster, Tommen a boy, and Cersei a viper. Margaery does her best to guide him, but she is hemmed in by the Lannisters at every turn. We all are. But what can be done? Lord Tywin is dead, and yet the Lannisters still hold the capital. They won't go down easily." "Perhaps not," Lady Olenna said, "but we Tyrells have everything they lack. We have the breadbasket of the realm, the gold of the Reach's bountiful harvests, the loyalty of many a lesser house. And now we have the Stormlands, or at least a good portion of them, cowering at our feet. Your father claims the victory in the name of Tommen Baratheon, but the men who swear to House Tyrell do so because they see we hold real power. They fear you, Loras, the Knight of Flowers who struck down the would-be usurper, Stannis. They respect your skill, your valor. Perhaps it is time to expand that respect into fealty, into a crown that rests on Tyrell brows. Perhaps Margaery's, or perhaps even yours." Loras felt a tremor pass through him at the notion. My oath is to the Kingsguard. I am sworn never to inherit lands, nor titles, nor—" Lady Olenna waved a hand dismissively. "Oaths can be broken as circumstances demand, dear boy, especially when they were made to false kings. If the entire realm acknowledges House Tyrell as the rightful rulers, you could shed your white cloak without shame." He struggled to respond, but the words lay tangled in his mind. The memory of Renly, the rightful king he had served, clashed with the notion that Loras could now claim that same seat. Would that be fulfilling Renly's desire or spitting on his grave by supplanting him entirely? A different memory surfaced. Renly's voice, warm and teasing, speaking of making Loras his sworn protector once he was crowned. In the end, Lady Olenna offered her counsel plainly. The Tyrells could either stand behind Tommen, remain effectively subservient to Lannister influence, or step forward and take what they believed belonged in more deserving hands. "House Tyrell is no mere vassal," she said. "We have the power to rule. I leave it to you to decide how you will shape that destiny." So it was that, within the fortress of Storm's End, as the storms raged outside, Loras Tyrell paced in the darkness of a candlelit chamber, grappling with the future. The weight of the Kingsguard cloak felt heavier than ever. He remembered the day he had accepted it, still reeling from Renly's loss, clinging to some sense of duty and honor. But if that duty had been to a false monarchy, was it truly binding? When dawn approached, Loras found himself standing on Storm's End's great battlements, facing the sea. The wind whipped at his hair, and the salt spray from the crashing waves struck his cheeks. He held his white cloak in his hands. For a long time, he merely stared at it, letting the wind tangle the fabric. Then, in a decisive motion, he flung it over the battlements, watching it spiral downward, disappearing into the tumult of the ocean below. He stood alone under the storm-laden sky, feeling a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. That white cloak had been a shield for his grief, a barrier behind which he could hide from the world. Now it was gone. He had taken the first irrevocable step toward forging a new path, toward claiming a destiny that might have belonged to Renly, and that might still honor him if Loras shaped it rightly. Within the week, Loras and the Tyrell host marched back toward King's Landing, but not as loyal bannermen to Tommen. Along the way, they sent ravens far and wide, proclaiming that Stannis was defeated and that the Tyrells had liberated the Stormlands from the grip of a false king. The letters also subtly hinted that King Tommen's hold on the throne was suspect, given the widespread rumors concerning the parentage of Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella. Moreover, they spoke of the many outrages committed by House Lannister. Not once in these letters did they declare open rebellion or claim the throne for themselves. But the message was clear. House Tyrell stood ready to guide the realm if need be. Margaery was still in the capital, queen in all but name, enchanting King Tommen and much of the court. She wrote to Loras in secret, cautioning him that Cersei had grown suspicious, that the small council was rife with conflict, and that the Iron Bank of Bravos had begun to pressure the crown for debts unpaid. Meanwhile, the small folk increasingly looked to the Reach for provisions as Winter's Spectre loomed closer. The stage was set for a power shift. When the Tyrell army arrived at the outskirts of King's Landing, they were welcomed by confused cheers and uncertain gates. Normally, such a large host would be perceived as a threat, but the Tyrells bore no banners of open rebellion, only the golden rose alongside the royal sigil, though placed in a manner that subtly suggested equality rather than subservience. The city guard, half loyal to Tommen and half under the sway of the Tyrells' gold, allowed them entrance. Inside the city, tension simmered like a cauldron close to boiling. The small folk lined the streets, muttering or cheering as the column marched past. They had heard that House Tyrell was distributing bread and grain in outlying villages. Some saw the rose banners and smiled, chanting, "The harvests come, the harvests come," a phrase that implied the Tyrells brought sustenance and relief. Others eyed them warily, uncertain if war was about to break out anew. At the Red Keep, King Tommen awaited them in the throne room. Young, wide-eyed, and flanked by only a handful of Lannister guards, he fidgeted upon the iron throne that dwarfed him. Cersei stood nearby, eyes narrowed with open hostility. Margaery, radiant and composed, stood at Tommen's other side. Highgarden knights escorted Mace Tyrell, Garland Tyrell, Lady Olenna, and Loras toward the throne. The contrast was stark. On one side, a boy king with a nervous retinue, and on the other, a powerful family that had just destroyed Stannis Baratheon's ambitions and taken the Stormlands in the process. Mace Tyrell bowed elaborately, greeting the king, while Olenna offered a curtsy that was little more than a tilt of her head. Garland remained stoic, while Loras stood silent, eyes flicking to Margaery. She gave him a small, knowing look, though no words were exchanged. Tommen voiced his gratitude, trembling slightly, for the Tyrells' loyal service. He attempted to welcome them, though it was clear he was parroting lines fed to him by his mother or some counselor. Cersei watched every movement like a lioness ready to pounce. Margaery, ever gracious, praised Tommen's wisdom for allowing the Tyrells to handle the Stannis threat. The moment felt like a fragile dance, each step carefully taken to avoid toppling the delicate alliance. But tension snapped when Lady Olenna's voice rang out clearly in the throne room, addressing Tommen with the utmost courtesy, yet lacing her words with subversive intent. Your Grace, House Tyrell remains committed to ensuring the stability of the realm, and we have found that certain troubling rumors about the legitimacy of your claim persist among the common folk. Indeed, rumors that question whether the Iron Throne might belong more rightfully to another. We, of course, do not support such rumors. Still, it might be prudent to quiet them through decisive leadership and clarity about the realm's future. Cersei's eyes blazed. How dare you suggest any impropriety regarding my son? She hissed. He is the true-born son of... Margaery gently intervened, placing a hand on Tommen's arm. Mother, no one questions Tommen's goodness or worth, she said, addressing Cersei with the practiced sweetness that infuriated the Queen Mother. We only observe that the realm is uneasy and wants reassurance. It is our duty to guide Tommen, to safeguard his rule. The subtle power struggle was visible to all in the throne room. Cersei stood on a precipice, uncertain whether to lash out or feign composure. Tommen tugged at his collar, looking overwhelmed. Mace Tyrell bowed again, speaking in a grandiose tone about how they would continue to serve King Tommen faithfully if the realm recognized his unquestionable right. We shall hold a great feast, Mace proclaimed, to celebrate our unity and the defeat of Stannis. Let all the lords and ladies of importance come to the capital, so they can witness House Tyrell's devotion to our king, and so the king can demonstrate his rightful authority. Little did Tommen or Cersei suspect that the Tyrells had spent the last weeks sending out invitations and forging alliances behind the scenes. By the time the feast was held, lords from the Reach, the Stormlands, and even the Riverlands, eager for stability, arrived in King's Landing. They came not to celebrate Tommen, but to weigh the possibility of a new monarchy. The city thrummed with intrigue. Spies and informants reported every movement of Lannister forces, every shift among the gold cloaks, every discreet meeting in back rooms. When the night of the feast arrived, the Red Keep was ablaze with torches and candelabras. The great hall was filled with lords and ladies in their finery, mingling as servants offered wine and platters of roast meats. Tommen sat at the high table, flanked by Margaery and Cersei, while the Tyrells filled the seats of honor beside them. 100 flickering flames cast shadows across the stone walls, where the sigil of the Golden Rose hung next to the crowned stag lion of Baratheon Lannister. Musicians played a lively tune, trying to drown out the undertone of tension that rippled through every conversation. Lady Olenna, sharp as ever, observed from her seat. She had not a drop of wine in her cup, preferring clarity of mind. Cersei, on the other hand, drank heavily, her glare fixed on the Tyrells, though she managed a thin smile whenever Tommen glanced her way. Margaery whispered softly to the boy king, guiding his conversation with the assembled lords, ensuring he smiled and thanked them for their service. Mace Tyrell boasted of the victory against Stannis, and Garland chimed in to praise the valor of the Reach's knights. As the feast progressed, courtesies were exchanged, alliances tested. By design, many lords approached Loras, congratulating him on defeating Stannis in single combat. They called him the finest knight in the realm, a man of unwavering resolve. Loras would offer a polite smile and a few humble words, but inwardly he felt the cold determination that had propelled him this far. He could sense that each praise was a stepping stone, each compliment a subtle pledge of support. When the time came for toasts, Mace Tyrell rose, raising a goblet high. He offered praise to King Tommen, to the might of the Tyrells, and to the hope for a lasting peace. Then he bowed and gestured for Loras to stand. Loras did so, wearing a simple surcoat bearing the golden rose. Eyes from every corner of the hall fell upon him. He felt his pulse flutter, remembering the justs of old when all had cheered for the Knight of Flowers, but this was no mere tournament. He was about to cross a threshold that might change the fate of Westeros. In a steady voice, he spoke of how he had once served Renly Baratheon, a king who aspired to bring warmth and prosperity to the realm. He spoke of how that dream had been cut short, leaving a void that led to war and suffering. He recounted his duel with Stannis Baratheon, praising Stannis' courage in battle but condemning the shadowy means by which Renly had been slain. A murmur ran through the crowd at that, for few dared speak so openly of sorcery. Still, the hall listened. Then he turned to Tommen. "Your Grace, I have worn the white cloak of the Kingsguard, and I have fought in your name. Yet, I stand before you now not as a Kingsguard knight, but as a man who loves this realm and grieves for its losses. Too many battles have soaked the soil in blood, Blackwater, the War of 5 Kings, the countless skirmishes ravaging the countryside. Our small folk starve, our lords bicker, and the winter grows near. We Tyrells have always sought to nurture life, to bring bounty to Westeros. We would see a king or queen who is not merely accepted, but cherished." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the hall. He saw the flicker of confusion on Tommen's face, the darkening rage on Cersei's, and the intense interest on the faces of many lords. "It is not my place," he said, voice quieter now, "to name myself above a rightful king, if such a king is indeed rightful. But I cannot ignore the cries of the realm any longer. Nor can I ignore the whispers that plague this court. Whispers that question your parentage, your grace. I do not say I believe them, nor do I say they hold no truth. But they will tear this realm apart if left unchecked." Tommen tried to stand, words forming on his lips, but Marjorie held him gently by the arm. Cersei practically trembled with fury. Loras pressed on. "We Tyrells will protect the realm. If necessary, we will claim the throne ourselves to save Westeros from further devastation. That is not a threat, nor is it an act of treason. It is a responsibility we bear, for we have the power and the will to stop this bloodshed." His declaration hung in the air like a thunderclap. The great hall exploded into an uproar. Some shouted condemnation, others cheered. Cersei sprang to her feet, hurling her goblet aside. "Traitor!" she spat, pointing at Loras. Guards tensed, uncertain whether to draw steel. Tommen looked tearful and confused, calling for order. Marjorie soothed him, leaning close to murmur something in his ear. Mace Tyrell's voice boomed, demanding calm. Lady Olenna rapped her cane on the floor with surprising force. "Settle yourselves, or we'll have no sense in this hall," she snapped. Gradually, the chaos ebbed, though it simmered dangerously beneath the surface. Cersei's eyes were wild. She gestured at Loras. "Arrest him, arrest them all," she screamed. But her words carried little weight, for in that moment, Knights of the Reach, stationed strategically around the hall, stepped forward. Some Lannister guards seemed ready to fight, but found themselves heavily outnumbered by Tyrell men. The tension rose to an unbearable pitch. Tommen quailed, looking around, but Marjorie squeezed his hand and gently coaxed him to speak. When the boy king found his voice, it was high and wavering. "Caesar Loras," he began. "Why would you do this? I trusted you, your house. Please lay down your arms. We can talk." The entire court waited for Loras's response. He inhaled, remembering Renly's gentle face, the promise of a better kingdom. If he were to back down now, the Tyrell's advantage might slip away. If he pressed forward, he was committing outright to a break with the Lannisters. At last, he gazed at Marjorie, who gave him a subtle nod. Their grandmother had arranged all of this carefully. The time for half measures had passed. He turned back to Tommen. "You are a good boy, your grace," he said softly, and he meant it. "But this city is wrapped in Lannister webs, in old resentments, in the shadow of your mother's manipulations. You cannot rule freely. It's time for a new reign, a reign of roses and life, not lions and strife." He nodded to the Knights of the Reach, who began to surround the royal dais. Cersei's shriek of outrage cut through the hall. She reached for Tommen, but Marjorie stepped between them. No harm will come to the boy, Marjorie declared, lifting her voice to the assembly, adopting a regal bearing that suggested a queen. House Tyrell wishes only to protect him from dangerous influences, for his own good. But Cersei would not be calmed. She lunged at Marjorie, nails bared, but was quickly restrained by 2 Tyrell guards. Her curses echoed off the stone walls, vile and full of hatred. Tommen looked near tears, not understanding how everything had unraveled. He tried to rise from his seat, but another guard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, guiding him to remain. A hush descended as Lady Olenna stood. All eyes turned to her. She fixed Cersei with a cool, imperious stare. "Cersei Lannister," she said, her voice carrying, "your father's cunning shielded you once, but your father is gone. The realm has seen you squander power, indulge your every whim, and sow discord. No longer shall your venom poison the 7 kingdoms. Take her to her chambers," she said to the guards. "She will remain there under watch until we determine the best course for the realm." Cersei screeched, fighting wildly, but she was soon carried away by the Tyrell guards, her curses fading down the corridor. Many lords in the hall gaped, hardly believing what they had witnessed. Some might have expected the Kingsguard to intervene, but the few present were far outnumbered by Tyrell men, and Jaime Lannister was away to the west, dealing with the Rivellins. Tommen's wide, frightened eyes turned to Marjorie. "What happens now?" he whispered. Marjorie took his hand gently. "You will be safe, Tommen," she said, her voice calm, almost motherly. "No harm will come to you, but you cannot remain king in such dangerous circumstances." She shot a look at Loras, who nodded, his heart twisting slightly at the sight of the boy's confusion. With that, Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. "The realm must be guided by one who can unite the 7 kingdoms," he pronounced. "We propose that a council of great lords and ladies be called, that they may select the new ruler. Of course, we expect they will find House Tyrell the most suitable to rule, given our bountiful resources, stable leadership, and recent triumphs." An uneasy murmur spread among the nobles. Some were quick to profess support, citing the Tyrells' wealth and the need for a strong hand to stave off the Lannisters' misrule. Others looked aghast, as though the very stones might cry out in protest. But no one openly dared challenge the Tyrells. For all intents and purposes, King's Landing was theirs. In the days that followed, the city was placed under Tyrell control. The Gold Cloaks, who had long been under the sway of whichever house paid them best, swiftly accepted Tyrell coin. Loyal Lannister retainers were forced to relinquish their posts or flee to the west. Tommen was well treated, kept in comfortable quarters. Marjorie and Lady Olenna began the subtle work of wooing or intimidating lords into accepting a great council. Word was sent across Westeros, inviting the High Lords to gather in the capital to determine the fate of the throne. All the while, Loras roamed the corridors of the Red Keep, feeling both exhilaration and unease. He had done it, he had killed Stannis, then helped cast down the Lannisters. Renly's murder was avenged in more ways than one, for the downfall of Stannis and the Lannisters meant that the very powers that had conspired against Renly were in disarray. Yet Loras wondered, had he truly honored Renly's memory, or had he used it as a stepping stone to power? Late one night, he found himself in the royal sept, a cavernous chamber lit by flickering candles. The marble floor reflected the distant stars visible through tall, narrow windows. Loras knelt before the statue of the warrior, seeking some hint of peace. He thought of Renly, of the love they had shared, of the king Renly had wished to be. A soft shuffle of footsteps approached. He turned to see Marjorie, a silvered shawl draped about her shoulders. Her expression was kind, though tinged with concern. She knelt beside him, placing a hand over his. "Brother," she murmured, "we are so close now. Soon the great council will convene. The lords will see reason. They will place a Tyrell on the throne. Perhaps me or perhaps you, if they deem it wise to have a king." Loras shook his head. "I never wanted a crown for myself," he admitted. "I wanted Renly to have it. He was everything. My vow was to protect him, but I failed. And now I have built this entire path of vengeance upon that failure. Marjorie's eyes glistened in the candlelight. You have not failed, she said softly. Renly's dream was a kind reign, a reign of plenty for the common folk. Together we can still realize that. If the lords crown me, I will need you by my side, Loras. Not merely as a sworn shield, but as the man who carries Renly's spirit. You can shape the realm in his name, if that helps you find peace. He clasped her hand tighter. She was right. Renly's vision could still be achieved, even if not by Renly himself. And if Marjorie wore the crown, Loras would do everything in his power to ensure that her rule was just and merciful, that the horrors of war did not repeat themselves. Perhaps that would be the final gift he could give to Renly's memory. Days bled into weeks as the Great Council loomed. Lords from the Reach, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, the Vale, and Dorne arrived, most with armed retinues. Yet the Tyrell hold on the capital was strong, and any attempt to wrest it from them would come at great cost. Marjorie, Lady Olenna, and Mace Tyrell worked tirelessly, hosting feasts for the visiting lords, showering them with gifts of food, wine, and gold. They promised that under a Tyrell monarchy, each region would be nurtured, not oppressed. Whispers abounded that the Lannister coffers were nearly empty, whereas the Tyrell storehouses were overflowing with grain and produce. The times favored the rose over the lion. Meanwhile, Cersei languished in a guarded tower, hurling insults at anyone who dared approach. Jaime Lannister, far from the city, was reportedly trying to muster forces to counter the Tyrell coup. But with House Lannister weakened by debt and the deaths of Tywin and Joffrey, few lords were eager to rally behind them. The realm, weary of war, seemed to gravitate toward whichever faction could promise stability and abundance. That was House Tyrell in spades. Finally, the day of the Great Council arrived. In the Dragon Pit, an ancient ruin large enough to hold thousands, the High Lords gathered. Rows of seats rose around a circular floor where the nominees for the throne would present their cases. It was an uneasy gathering. Armed men lined the perimeter, tensions ran high, and many suspected that a single insult could trigger bloodshed. But House Tyrell had meticulously prepared, ensuring that the majority of lords and knights were inclined in their favor. Foremost among the claimants was, of course, Tommen Baratheon, who was brought forth under guard. He was accompanied by a bitter-faced Cersei, still allowed to stand at his side to represent the Lannister interest, though her power was largely ceremonial at this point. As Tommen meekly stated his claim, citing that he was the recognized heir of King Robert Baratheon, onlookers muttered about his rumored incestuous parentage, a rumor none dared speak to openly before but which was now an open secret. The boy could barely contain his tears, and Cersei's attempts to speak on his behalf drew scorn or disinterest from most of the gathered lords. Next were a few lesser claimants, distant Targaryen pretenders or self-styled kings from the chaos of the War of the Five Kings. Their claims were swiftly dismissed or laughed out of the Dragon Pit. The lords of Westeros were weary of endless battles, and these upstarts had neither wealth nor influence to persuade them. Then, Marjorie Tyrell stepped forward, accompanied by Loras at her right and Garland at her left. She wore a gown of shimmering green, the bodice embroidered with golden roses. The crowd hushed as she spoke. She did not claim the throne by blood right, for House Tyrell could not match the lineage of the Targaryens or Baratheons in that sense. Instead, she spoke of a different kind of right, the right of the people to a ruler who could feed them, protect them, and end the bloodshed. She detailed how House Tyrell had saved the capital during the siege, brought bounty where the Lannisters had sown only fear, and vanquished Stannis Baratheon. She invoked the memory of Renly, the king who had once offered Westeros a hopeful vision, and pledged to uphold that vision if crowned. Her words resonated powerfully. Lords from the Reach applauded. Lords from other regions, sensing the benefits of a wealthy and generous queen, murmured in agreement. Even lords who might have been reluctant to accept a Tyrell monarch found themselves swayed by the practicalities. The Tyrells had the coin, the crops, and the capacity to stabilize the realm. The alternative was continued chaos, or a child king overshadowed by a toxic regent. Cersei, outraged, shouted accusations of treason, but her voice was drowned out by the chorus of voices rising in support of Margaery. The tide was unstoppable. The lords began to cast their votes or voice their allegiance in the old style, calling out their house names and who they supported. House Redwyne, House Tarly, House Hightower, House Oakhart. All the great houses of the Reach pledged Margaery Tyrell. Many Stormland lords, newly subdued by the Tyrell victory over Stannis, also voiced support, hoping for leniency. The Riverland lords, exhausted by the conflicts with the Freys and the Lannisters, largely fell in line, believing that House Tyrell offered stability. The Vale lords, led by the cunning Lord Peter Baelish as regent for young Lord Robert Arryn, smelled opportunity for personal gain in a Tyrell monarchy, so they too offered their support, albeit with sly caveats. Dorne was the wild card, but even Doran Martell, from afar, seemed more inclined to remain neutral than to oppose a rising power. In that grand amphitheater, the matter was settled with surprising swiftness. The voice of House Lannister, once so dominant, had been reduced to a whisper. Jaime was far away and had not arrived in time. Kevin Lannister had died under mysterious circumstances. Tyrion was in exile. The few Lannisters present could only watch in horror as the Great Council proclaimed Margaery Tyrell the rightful Queen of the Seven Kingdoms by acclamation, naming her the Chosen of the People and the Rose of Highgarden. At the close of the council, Margaery ascended the dais that had been set up for the new monarch. Her posture was regal, her eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and relief. A hush fell as the High Septon, who had also been quietly wooed by Tyrell generosity, performed the sacred rite, placing a slender golden crown upon her brow. "Hail Margaery of the House Tyrell," he proclaimed, voice echoing across the dragon pit. First of her name, Queen of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Protector of the Realm. The crowd erupted in cheers. Trumpets sounded. Green and gold petals rained down from the higher tiers. In that moment, the power of the Iron Throne shifted in a manner that few could have predicted only a short while ago. House Tyrell had claimed the monarchy, not through ancient blood ties but through political maneuvering, wealth, and a promise of prosperity. Loras Tyrell stood just behind his sister, gazing up at her crown. He remembered, in a flash, Renly placing a makeshift crown of flowers on her hair once, during an old tourney feast. And then he saw again the shadow that had murdered Renly, and his own blade striking the fatal blow that ended Stannis' life. He saw Renly's dream, unfulfilled, now kindled anew in Margaery's ascension. His heart felt full and hollow all at once, but he bowed his head in submission and devotion, tears brimming in his eyes. When Margaery's gaze found him, she reached out a hand. He took it, rising to stand by her side. The moment was captured in the eyes of all assembled. The new queen and her brother, the Knight of Flowers, who had slain the last real challenger. For all the realm, it was a symbol of the Tyrell ascendancy, a bloom rising from the ashes of war. Tommen was quietly led away, to be taken into comfortable captivity. Cersei was left stunned, nearly catatonic with fury, as she realized she had lost everything. The Lannister banners in the city were quietly taken down, replaced by the Golden Rose. The crown's debts to the Iron Bank would need to be addressed, but that was a concern for another day. In the following weeks, Queen Margaery Tyrell began the laborious task of consolidating her rule. She issued decrees aimed at restoring trade, lowering taxes for small folk, and distributing Reach grain to hungry regions. Loras took on the role of Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard, a newly minted position for a newly minted monarchy, his white cloak symbolically replaced with a cloak of pale green and gold. Mace Tyrell was named Hand of the Queen, though it was an open secret that Lady Olenna's counsel guided much of the policy. Garland Tyrell was charged with solidifying alliances across the realm, as well as dealing diplomatically with the North and the Iron Islands, where strife still burned. Yet through all the pomp and circumstance, Loras remained haunted by memories of Renly. Some nights, he would wander the gardens of the Red Keep, now sown with bright roses, and recall how Renly had once laughed under a canopy of flowers at Highgarden. He would stand near a marble bench and close his eyes, half expecting Renly to appear and tease him for being so serious. But when he opened them, There was only the darkness, illuminated by pale moonlight. One evening, Marjorie found him there, running her fingers along the petals of a new rosebush. "You've been quiet," she observed. "I worry for you. Is there nothing in this world that might soothe your soul?" He managed a faint smile. "I have what I wanted," he said quietly. "Stannis is dead. The Lannisters are toppled. Our house sits the Iron Throne. All of it was for him, for Renly's memory. But there's a part of me that wonders if Renly would have approved of the lengths we've gone." Marjorie reached up, gently touching her brother's cheek. "He would have understood," she said softly. "He would know you did what you must. He loved you, Loras, and he loved me in his way. Now we carry his vision forward, tempered by the lessons we've learned. This realm will be better under a rose than under a lion or a stag." In that moment, a breeze carried the scent of roses through the garden. Loras inhaled, feeling the faintest easing of the knot inside him. Perhaps this was the best they could do, to build something kinder out of the wreckage of all that had come before. Renly's dream would endure, even if it bore the Tyrell name. As the moonlight bathed the garden, Marjorie and Loras stood together, their figures outlined in silver. In the distance, the city lights twinkled, and from some far corner of the Red Keep, a nightingale trilled a plaintive song. The Tyrell sigil, the golden rose, now flew proudly over the capital, signifying a new age. It was an age born of vengeance and ambition, fueled by heartbreak and cunning. Loras had slain Stannis, the man who killed his king. He had helped topple the Lannisters, who had used his house for their own ends. And now, in the hush of that moonlit garden, he silently vowed that he would do everything in his power to ensure that this new reign did not become just another tyranny. It would be a reign that might, at last, bring to fruition the gentle, prosperous land Renly had once envisioned. If that required blood in the soil, so be it. From that blood would rise the blossoms of House Tyrell's future, an empire of flowers that might yet lend beauty and mercy to a realm starved for both. Even with that resolve, Loras Tyrell knew that the path ahead would not be free of perils. The north still simmered with its own sense of independence. The Iron Islands yearned for plunder, Dorne harbored old grudges, and across the narrow sea, whispers of dragons and Targaryen restoration might threaten everything one day. But for the present moment, the people embraced their new queen, hearts buoyed by hope for a fairer rule. So the Knight of Flowers, who had once pledged his sword to a beloved king that fate had torn from him, found himself at the heart of a new monarchy, one that he had helped carve out with steel, gold, and cunning. The taste of vengeance had been bittersweet on his tongue, but the taste of possibility was altogether different. Perhaps there, in the shade of the red gold throne, he would finally lay Renly's ghost to rest, forging a realm worthy of the man he had loved. And thus began the reign of Marjorie Tyrell, the Rose Queen, with her brother Loras standing guard at her side, sword in hand, unyielding in his resolve. If the storms came again, if the dragons of old returned, if the north rose or the shadows crept once more, House Tyrell would face them. Together, crowned with roses, hearts brimming with a long overdue promise of spring. For the first time in many seasons, the small folk of Westeros dared to hope, for a king or queen had claimed the throne not through mere birthright, but through a vow to feed and protect them. And the memory of Renly Baratheon lived on, woven into the tapestry of this new era, for it was his dream, kindled anew, that bloomed now in the gardens of the Red Keep. Marjorie Tyrell's coronation as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms was a dazzling affair, yet it took place in the raw and weather-worn shell of the dragon pit. Roses and lilies from the Reach filled the ancient amphitheater with their sweet fragrance, while the gathered lords, ladies, and knights formed a sea of colorful silks and polished mail. When the High Septon placed the slender, golden crown upon her head, the sun caught in the metal, casting a bright halo around her auburn hair. A roar of approval had risen from many throats, matched by the stunned silence of those who still clung to the old ways and the old monarchy. That was the moment when everything changed. Once the dragon pit emptied and the dust of ceremony settled, the new queen returned with her retinue to the Red Keep. The hush of the corridors and the startled courtiers testified to how swiftly House Tyrell had taken possession of the capital. Everywhere one looked, golden roses replaced the crimson banners of House Lannister. Green and gold livery clothed the men who patrolled the halls. The guards posted outside the royal apartments were men sworn not to a lion or a stag but to the Rose Queen herself. Yet for all the brilliance of her coronation, Margaery felt the realm's troubles pressing in from every side. She had claimed a precarious seat, one that demanded both diplomacy and unyielding resolve. Lady Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, had once advised her that ruling the Seven Kingdoms was more difficult than winning them, and this Margaery knew to be true. She would have to unify a land torn by too many wars, haunted by the ghosts of the War of Five Kings, and threatened still by unrest beyond the borders of the capital. That first evening after her crowning, Margaery sat in the small council chamber of the Red Keep, a newly appointed council at her side. Gone were the Lannister placeholders, the sycophants, and the heads of the old regime. Instead, the table was lined with familiar faces from the Reach, Stormlands, and several riverlords who had proven their loyalty, or their pragmatism. Mace Tyrell, her father, held the title of Hand of the Queen. He wore a pleased, self-satisfied expression throughout the meeting, as if the entire realm were a prize he had just collected for his family. Lady Olenna sat near him, her cane propped against the table, her eyes sharp and hawkish. Garland Tyrell was present, mild in demeanor yet uncompromising when it came to the defense of their position. And there was Loras, the newly named Lord Commander of the Queensguard, still resplendent in his fresh cloak of pale green trimmed with gold, though he wore a pensiveness behind his stoic bearing. Rounding out the council were a few key Stormland lords, among them Lord Caron of Nightsong and Lord Estermont, cautiously trying to find their place under a Tyrell crown. Margaery wanted to present a broad coalition, a sign that her rule was not merely an extended branch of Highgarden's domain, but a sincere attempt at uniting all corners of the realm. Every detail mattered now. How she addressed these lords, the tone of her voice, even the refreshments served at the table. If she wished to maintain power without plunging the kingdom into a new war, she had to balance courtesy and quiet intimidation in equal measure. She glanced at her father. Mace Tyrell puffed out his chest and began to speak in grandiose tones about the tasks at hand. Foremost among them was to secure the loyalty of the Crownlands and quell any pockets of resistance that might linger outside the city. Next, they needed to address the chronic shortages and debts that plagued King's Landing. The old monarchy's debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos were no small matter. Tywin Lannister had once kept the realm solvent through cunning negotiations and the Lannisters' own gold reserves, but Tywin was dead, and the Lannisters' wealth, though substantial, was no longer at the realm's disposal. More and more, the Tyrell coffers would have to fill the gaps, or else face the Iron Bank's retribution. Finally, Mace Tyrell raised the issue of Tommen Baratheon, still a child, effectively removed from the throne. Would the Tyrell regime keep him at court as a ward, or lock him away as a potential threat? The council murmured uncertainly over that question. Margaery listened, letting the talk swirl before interjecting. She spoke gently but firmly. "We will not harm Tommen. He is a boy and he has no fault in his birth. The realm will see us as compassionate if we treat him kindly. In truth, those who doubt my legitimacy might be appeased by knowing that Tommen is here under my protection. It is better to keep him near. The mother, on the other hand," Lady Olenna said tartly, "must be dealt with more decisively. Cersei Lannister is a lioness in a cage. She'll grow vicious if we let her roam free." "My queen," said Lord Caron in a respectful tone. "Cersei remains a potent symbol for House Lannister. They've not yet given up. If you hold her in the Red Keep, her presence could be a magnet for dissent." Margaery toyed with one of her rings, a golden rose twining around a pale green gemstone. "I will not have her executed," she said quietly, though her voice carried a finality. "We have spilled enough blood, and the small folk deserve to see that I can govern without endless executions. Let her remain confined in the Tower of the Hand, under guard. She will have suitable comforts, but no chance to sow discord." The council nodded, though Mace Tyrell's brow furrowed as if he might have preferred a more robust punishment. Lady Olenna only chuckled, tapping her cane. A wise decision, she conceded, provided the guards keep her in check. Only ensure they do not grow too sympathetic to her tears. Marjorie inclined her head, then asked, "What of Jaime Lannister?" The question hovered. Jaime was far to the west, rallying what remained of the Lannister bannermen. If he chose open warfare against the Tyrell crown, there would likely be more bloodshed. But would the Westerlands rise in full, or would they hesitate? The Ironborn, many of whom roved the coasts, might exploit any sign of weakness in the west, further complicating Jaime's attempts. "We have sent envoys," Mace Tyrell responded, "inviting Lord Jaime to treat with us. So far, we have had no reply." Lady Olenna's lip curled. "The Kingslayer may fancy himself the rightful protector of his sister and nephew, but we hold them both here, and he must know he cannot breach the capital without an army. An army that would cost him dearly. I suspect he is weighing his options." Loras leaned forward in his seat, his armor faintly clinking. "If Jaime Lannister chooses war, I will lead the Queen's Guard and a host from the Reach to face him." His voice was calm, but his eyes carried a flicker of the same merciless steel that had seen Stannis Baratheon slain. "We will not allow any threat to your reign, Your Grace." Marjorie placed a hand gently on his wrist. "Let us hope it does not come to that. Every new battle saps our strength. We must show the realm that peace can truly reign under a Tyrell crown." The council meeting went on late into the night, discussing trade routes, grain distribution, the disposition of royal fleet ships along the Blackwater, and the ramifications of the looming winter that Old Town's maesters predicted would soon spread across the land. Marjorie insisted that House Tyrell's storehouses open for the good of the realm. Lord Caron and other Stormland lords complained gently about the cost, but she overruled them. "The people are the source of our strength," she said. "If we allow them to starve, we will sow rebellion, and all our efforts to seat ourselves upon the throne will be for naught." When the meeting finally ended, most of the lords departed with weary bows and elaborate courtesies. Marjorie felt the weight of the crown pressing upon her brow, heavier than she had anticipated. She left the small council chamber with a sense that the night's work was only the beginning of a long struggle. She was queen, but she needed to rule like one, and ruling Westeros was no easy feat. She retired to her new royal apartments, a suite once occupied by the Targaryens, then by Robert Baratheon, and later by King Joffrey before his death. The carved wooden panels glowed in the candlelight, the windows looking out over the dark silhouette of the city. A servant lit the hearth. Marjorie dismissed the others, feeling a need for solitude, but just before she could close the door, Lady Olenna's cane rapped on the threshold. "May I enter, or shall I stand out here like a fool?" the Queen of Thorns demanded. Marjorie inclined her head, stepping aside. She had expected her grandmother to speak with her privately at some point. Once inside, Olenna appraised the furnishings with a disdainful twist of her mouth, then turned to face Marjorie. "You've begun well enough," she said. "Though these men around us, my dear, the moment they suspect weakness, they will circle like vultures. Remember that." Marjorie sank onto a cushioned seat by the hearth. "I know. That is why I must show them I can reign without becoming a butcher. If I brandish the sword at every corner, I'll be no better than Cersei or the Mad King." Her grandmother nodded slowly. "A measured approach, yes, but you must also be certain not to appear too soft. Your father, for instance, is prone to compromise. He wishes to please everyone, which pleases no one in the end. As for Loras, he is guided by heartbreak more than he realizes. Keep him close, but watch him carefully." She paused, and her gaze turned momentarily warm. "In any event, you have me, you have your father, your brothers. House Tyrell stands behind you. That is more support than most new monarchs could dream of." Marjorie managed a faint smile. "Thank you, grandmother. I won't forget it." When Olenna left, Marjorie found herself alone in the hush of the royal bedchamber. She stared at the flickering shadows on the walls, recalling the day's triumph and the larger tasks looming. She felt that heady mixture of confidence and fear that came with supreme power. Slowly, she rose and moved to the window, gazing out over the city's winding streets. In the distance, lights glittered along the Blackwater, and she wondered if across those dark waters, a new threat was already brewing. A few floors below, in the newly established Queensguard barracks, formerly part of the Kingsguard's domain, Loras removed his armor piece by piece. The metal was damp with sweat, and his limbs ached from tension. Outside, a pair of Tyrell guardsmen walked the corridors, their boots echoing in the gloom. Loras set his breastplate aside and sank onto a narrow bench, pressing his hands to his face. He had done it. He had avenged Renly's death by slaying Stannis, then cast aside the Lannisters to elevate his own sister to the throne. The result was everything he had once dreamed of, yet the victory felt hollow in places he could not name. In quieter moments, the guilt that perhaps Renly would not have wanted this kind of upheaval gnawed at him. But it was done. There was no turning back. He reached for a wineskin, took a long draught, then stared into the torchlit corridor. The hush reminded him of Storm's End after the battle, the silent fortress that offered no comfort. Loras had come to realize that, for all his skill with a blade, his real trial was just beginning. He had to be the strong right arm of the Queen, the enforcer who protected her from all the realm's treacheries. He had to make the dream real, to prove that a Tyrell monarchy was not an empty claim but a path to peace and prosperity. When morning arrived, the city awoke to the clang of blacksmiths, the calls of merchants, and the gossip of small folk. Word spread rapidly that Margaery Tyrell was now their queen. Some accepted the news with hope, praising the generosity of the Reach and remembering how the Tyrells had once salvaged the city from starvation during Stannis' siege. Others whispered more anxiously, recalling that all new powers inevitably demanded their pound of flesh. But one difference was quickly noticed. Tyrell men patrolled the streets distributing fresh loaves of bread. Carts from the Reach rolled in with sacks of flour, vegetables, and salted meats, ensuring that the markets in Fleabottom had cheaper wares than they had in years. Starvation and the petty riots that had plagued the capital during Joffrey's reign abruptly eased. In a city as large as King's Landing, that alone was enough to garner cautious goodwill for the new monarch. While Margaery busied herself with the daily tasks of governance, Lady Olenna navigated the delicate matter of reorganizing the royal household. She replaced Lannister stewards with men and women loyal to Highgarden. Subtly, she also began to investigate any trace of Old King's Landing corruption that might lead to sabotage. Bribery, blackmail, and betrayal had been the coin of the realm under the Lannisters, and Olenna was determined that such intrigues would either be used to her advantage or swept away before they could hamper Margaery's reign. In the Tower of the Hand, the disgraced Queen Mother, Cersei Lannister, languished under guard. She was permitted visitors only if they had explicit permission from the Queen. Mostly, she was ignored. Rumor said that Cersei spent her days in raging outbursts, hurling furniture at the guards, then sinking into sullen despair, drinking too much wine. Margaery did not relish her enemy's suffering, but she could not forget Cersei's cruelties either. Better to keep her contained than allow her free reign to undermine the new rule. Only a handful of courtiers dared visit Cersei, and each visit was scrutinized. Loras himself avoided her, for the memory of Joffrey, for the vile words she had once spoken of Renly, and for the knowledge that she had tried to sabotage Margaery time and again. Yet, on the third day of Margaery's reign, a rumor reached Loras's ears that someone had come to see Cersei, a person with golden hair rumored to be a Lannister cousin. Intrigued and wary, Loras decided to investigate. He climbed the winding stairs of the Tower of the Hand, accompanied by 2 Queensguard knights. Outside Cersei's chamber stood half a dozen Tyrell guards. At the sight of Loras, they parted to allow him entry. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room reeking of spilled wine. Cersei slumped in a chair by the cold hearth, her once lustrous blonde hair unkempt. Opposite her stood a lean young man with curling locks of gold and a fine gray cloak pinned at his shoulder by a small lion brooch. They seemed deep in conversation, though Cersei's face twisted in disdain. Loras advanced a few steps. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice curt. "And what is your business with Lady Cersei?" He deliberately avoided calling her the Queen Mother. The man turned, revealing a handsome, if somewhat fox-like, face. His eyes flicked over Loras's armor and the golden roses embossed on the breastplate. "I am Davin Lannister," he said. "Fourth cousin once removed to Lord Tywin, so far as the lines go. I came to see Lady Cersei, to bring her news from the Westerlands." Cersei made a scornful sound. "Which so-called news do you bring, dear cousin? That Jaime languishes in the west, forced to kneel to the rose whore." She spat the phrase, though her lips shook with bitterness. Davin kept a wary eye on Loras, then said carefully, "I came to advise you that Lord Jaime does not wish to plunge the Westerlands into war unless absolutely necessary. He is attempting to negotiate a settlement. He would prefer your freedom and Tommen's safety, guaranteed by the Tyrell Queen." Loras gave a humorless smile. "Tell me, then, cousin Lannister, what does Jaime offer in return? The Tyrells have no shortage of coin or men. The Westerlands is battered, its mines producing less than half of what they once did. I see little that your family can promise us." Davin straightened. "We can promise peace. We can promise an end to the bloodshed. The gold mines may be less bountiful than before, but they are not empty. And House Lannister still wields substantial influence over many lords in the West. If you want a stable realm, you need the Westerlands. They will never submit if you keep Cersei locked away indefinitely." Cersei's hollow laugh filled the chamber. "You see, Ser Loras? Even when your sister wears her stolen crown, she needs Lannister cooperation." How droll. Loras's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to her, ignoring Davin for the moment. "You speak of a stolen crown, yet you served a bastard boy enthroned by incest and lies. Save your accusations, Cersei. You are in no position to fling them." For an instant, old hatred flared in Cersei's green eyes, and he almost expected her to lash out. But she contained herself, lips curling. "You Tyrells fancy yourselves heroes, but the realm will soon see you for what you are. Opportunists who took advantage of a child to seize power. They'll turn on you. The small folk always do." Loras forced himself to remain calm, remembering Marjorie's words about sparing bloodshed. He turned back to Davin Lannister. "Your presence here is known now, cousin. If you intend to remain in the capital, you'll do so under watch until we ascertain Jaime's intentions. Rest assured, your safety will be respected, provided you do not conspire against the Queen." Davin inclined his head, his expression guarded. "I will not cause trouble, sir. I've come only to open dialogue." "Then we have no quarrel," Loras replied. "But if you try to smuggle Cersei out of here or rouse a rebellion in the city, you'll pay for it in blood." Cersei gave another scornful laugh. "You truly think you can keep me locked up forever?" Before Loras could retort, Davin took a step back, dipping his chin. "We have said all we need for now. Ser Loras, I await the Queen's summons if she wishes to speak of peace." Loras gestured for him to leave. The door shut, and Cersei was left glaring at Loras. The silence between them was fraught, thick with old rancor. She shook her head with a bitter smile. "You're still the lovesick pup who followed my husband's brother," she said quietly, her tone edged with cruelty. "Only now you've replaced Renly's illusions with your own. Do you think Marjorie's reign will last? I promise you it won't. Even if Jaime refuses to raise an army, enemies will spring up like weeds, and you will be forced to kill them all one by one." Loras steadied himself. Cersei's words struck near his insecurities. "We will do what we must," he said, summoning a cold finality in his voice. "Your time is over. Best accept it." With that, he turned and left. Outside the door, he took a moment to compose himself, inhaling the cool corridor air. Cersei's venom still pricked at his thoughts, but he pushed it aside, reminding himself that Marjorie had the city, the small folks' tentative approval, and a strong alliance with the Reach. The Lannisters were no longer unstoppable. Their gold no longer outweighed the Tyrell harvests. Yet as he headed back toward the Great Hall, He could not shake the sense that Cersei's prophecy of rising enemies was not mere bitterness. The realm was too fractured, too bruised by war, for a single coronation to unify it all at once. There were the Northmen to consider, the remnants of the Stark cause, the Boltons' uncertain hold on Winterfell, the rumors of a surviving Stark girl. There were the Ironborn, who prowled the western coasts, and the Martells in Dorne, who had no love for either Lannisters or Tyrells. And in the east, across the narrow sea, whispers of a Targaryen queen with dragons persisted, though none had seen her in Westeros yet. He pressed on, determined to stand firm. If foes arose, House Tyrell would meet them. That was the vow he had made. He had not thrown down Stannis Baratheon, nor cast aside Tommen, only to yield now. Days turned into weeks, and the Tyrell grip on King's Landing continued to solidify. Margaery held audiences in the throne room, hearing supplicants and petitioners from every walk of life. Some came to beg for better trade conditions or lowered taxes. Others brought personal quarrels. A few sought her royal justice against corrupt officials left over from the Lannister regime. She dispensed judgments carefully, always mindful of how each ruling would be perceived by the populace. The presence of bread in the markets and Tyrell knights in the streets went a long way toward quelling open dissent. On the surface, the city was more at peace than it had been in years. Crime declined, the faith militant, rearmed during Cersei's time, remained subdued after a brief negotiation with Margaery that promised the restoration of certain privileges for the faith but required them to keep out of secular justice. The High Septon, hand-picked by the Lannisters once, now found himself reliant on Tyrell charity. Thus, in the Red Keep's sept, prayers for the Queen's health and long reign became a frequent refrain. In private, however, Margaery and her closest advisors knew the calm was tenuous. Missives from the west indicated that Jaime Lannister was still gathering men, though not enough to launch a large-scale offensive. Messages from the north were more disconcerting. Rumors of wildling incursions below the wall, talk of some new king in the north, and a savage tension between the Boltons and scattered northern loyalists. Margaery wondered if the north might break away entirely. Of all the threats, the north was perhaps the most distant, but also the most unpredictable. She decided that forging a settlement with the Westerlands was the immediate priority. If she could bring Jaime Lannister to heal peacefully, she might then focus on preventing further fragmentation of the realm. So she dispatched Garland Tyrell as an emissary, offering generous terms. Jaime would be permitted to keep Casterly Rock under House Lannister's dominion. In return, he must formally acknowledge Margaery's sovereignty, swear fealty, and accept that neither Tommen nor Cersei would ever claim the throne again. Cersei would remain a guest in King's Landing, released to Jaime's custody only if he complied fully and guaranteed no further rebellion. Garland departed with a retinue of knights and scribes, bearing Margaery's official seal. The Queen placed her trust in his calm competence. Meanwhile, Lady Olenna continued her relentless mission of consolidating power in the capital. Mace Tyrell prepared to host a grand feast for the lords of the Stormlands, hoping to cement their loyalty with wine, entertainment, and the promise of trade benefits. Loras attended to his duties as the Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard, drilling new recruits to fill the vacant slots left after the ouster of the old Kingsguard. One balmy afternoon, while Loras oversaw practice in the Red Keep's courtyard, Margaery appeared at the edge of the training yard, flanked by her ladies-in-waiting. Loras paused in demonstrating a disarm technique to a young knight and saluted his sister with a flourish. The men around him stepped back, giving the Queen space. She dismissed her ladies with a nod and approached Loras alone, her expression pensive. "Brother," she said in a low voice, "there is a matter I must discuss with you, away from prying ears." Loras sheathed his training blade. "Of course, Your Grace." He gestured toward a shaded alcove beneath the castle's ramparts, where the clang of swords would not be so loud. Once there, he noticed that Margaery's face was drawn, her brow creased. "You look troubled," he ventured. She sighed. "I have received another raven from the north. Apparently, the situation there grows more complicated. There are rumors, wild rumors, of a resurrection, of a Stark retaking Winterfell. Lord Bolton's hold is weakening. But the messages are full of contradictions. The maesters say that the nights are growing longer, that the true winter is near. And you know what the north is like in winter, hard and apt to defy any southern rule. Loras glanced at the bustling courtyard. You think the north might declare independence? The Boltons bent the knee to the Iron Throne, but the northern lords hate them for betraying the Starks. If a Stark heir has emerged— Precisely, Marjorie said with a nod. They might rally to a Stark, ignoring my claim entirely. The question is, do we intervene, attempt to quell the unrest and assert my authority? Or do we let them fight it out among themselves, risking that they emerge as an independent kingdom under a resurgent House Stark? Loras frowned. Marching an army into the north during winter is madness, especially while we have yet to secure the west. Even if the climate were not a concern, the Northmen themselves would resent an intrusion. You might win a few battles, but you would lose them in the long run, I fear. Marjorie's fingers toyed with the edge of her sleeve, embroidered with gold thread. That is my feeling as well. But we cannot ignore the north completely. If they break away, it will embolden Dorne or the Iron Islands to do the same. Then the realm fractures, and all my efforts to unify it come to nothing. Loras's mind churned. Perhaps we should send an envoy, someone the Northmen might accept as a mediator. Not soldiers, but a diplomatic mission. If House Stark is truly re-emerging, we can offer them recognition of their old titles and privileges, wardens of the North and so on, provided they acknowledge your sovereignty. But we must act carefully. The Northerners are proud. Marjorie considered his words. A fine idea, she said softly. I will gather a small delegation. Perhaps I will include a Stormland lord or two, to show that I have the support of other regions. If the rumors are baseless and no true Stark has returned, then we have only the Boltons to appease or replace. If the rumors are true, we may gain an ally. She paused, her gaze drifting across the courtyard to where a row of newly minted Queensguard knights stood. Her eyes clouded. But that is not all I wish to speak of. Loras, I know you have given much of yourself to place me on the throne. In doing so, you cast aside your old cloak, the white one you wore under the Lannisters. You have poured your heart into this cause, but grandmother is worried that your thirst for retribution might blind you. He opened his mouth to protest but found that he had no immediate response. In truth, he still felt the hunger for vengeance in his veins. Though Stannis was dead, and the Lannisters who had scorned Renly were humbled. I only wish to protect you, to defend our house, he said at last. Marjorie laid a gentle hand on his arm. I know, but I also remember the man you were before grief consumed you. The Knight of Flowers, proud in tournaments, graceful in the saddle, full of gallantry that made you beloved by the small folk. It is not only your sword that the realm needs. It needs your heart, Loras, the one capable of mercy as well as might. Her words brought a lump to his throat. He nodded, unable to articulate the swirl of regret, love, and weariness within him. She must have sensed it, because she squeezed his arm reassuringly. Come to my solar tonight, she said. We will talk more, along with grandmother. There are plans to be made, and I would have you at my side not just as a shield but as a partner in these decisions. He bowed his head. As you wish, your grace. She departed, crossing the courtyard with measured steps, the train of her gown trailing behind her. Loras stood there for a moment, thinking about how much had changed. The boy who had once idolized Renly, who had chased tournament glory, was now the Queen's chief enforcer, the slayer of kings, the instrument of a new regime. Could he become again that man who was known for graciousness as well as skill? Or was that person lost forever on the night Renly died? Evening found him in Marjorie's solar, which overlooked the inner gardens of the Red Keep. The Queen sat by the broad window, reading a leather-bound volume of genealogies. Lady Olenna was there too, perched in a high-backed chair, her cane resting against her knee. A small table bore a decanter of wine and 2 crystal goblets. Soft lamplight illuminated the tapestry-draped walls. Loras entered quietly, and Marjorie nodded for him to sit. "I've been speaking with grandmother about a matter that concerns not only us but the entire realm," she began. "We believe it is time to strengthen the ties between the great houses. An arranged marriage or two might be the most effective means." His brow furrowed. "Whose marriage do you propose?" Olenna cleared her throat. "Yours for a start. Or Garland's, if necessary. But Garland is already wed. So it must be you, dear boy." Loras felt a cold ripple pass through him. The idea of another marriage, of wedding a woman to secure alliances, reminded him too much of how Renly and Margaery had once wed, their union more political than romantic. "Me," he said, voice low, "I am sworn to your service as Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard. It would be unorthodox." Lady Olenna scoffed. "That cloak of yours, dear, was granted by your sister's decree. Can be as easily rescinded. The realm needs strong ties, and you are a valuable piece on the board. Don't look so shocked. It's a practical matter." Margaery set the genealogy book aside. "I would not force you if your heart rebels," she said gently. "But the truth is that an alliance by marriage could secure, for instance, the Vale or Dorne. Lord Peter Baelish still rules the Vale as regent for young Robert Arryn, and I do not trust him entirely. Dorne harbors its own grudges but remains quiet. Perhaps we could unify with them. Or the Westerlands, if Jaime refuses to yield. A marriage to a Lannister cousin might seal the peace." Loras winced. He hated the idea of wedding a Lannister after all that had happened, but the mere notion flared in his mind, conjuring images of a forced union for the sake of political advantage. I do not know if I can do this," he murmured. Olenna's gaze softened, rare but genuine. "We ask much of you, I know," she said. "But you must understand that we Tyrells are no longer mere vassals, we are the royal house. We must think in terms of forging bonds, bridging old hatreds. The realm is bigger than any single heartache." A tense silence followed. Loras remembered all too well the heartbreak that had driven him to extremes. He had not simply lost a lover, he had lost the possibility of a life lived openly. Now, the monarchy he had helped create threatened to entangle him in a political marriage that would be hollow in every sense. Yet he also understood the logic. If it was the difference between uniting the realm and plunging it back into war, he had to at least consider it. Margaery's voice was gentle. "I've written to Doran Martell, inquiring after the status of his children. There is Prince Trystane, of course, but also there are nieces. A betrothal between you and one of the Sand Snakes might be something Doran would consider, though they are still technically bastards unless he petitions for their legitimization. There are also the Lannister cousins to consider, or the Redwine girls, or perhaps a match in the north if we manage to restore stability there. No final decision has been made, but I wanted you to be aware of where our thoughts lie." Loras nodded, feeling a heavy weight on his chest. "I will do my duty," he said quietly, "but please give me time." Margaery nodded, relief mixing with sympathy on her face. Olenna reached for the wine decanter and poured 2 cups, offering one to Loras. He took it gratefully, swallowing the dryness in his throat. The discussion moved on to other matters, including the possible alliance with Dorne, the status of negotiations with Jaime Lannister, and the rumor that the Ironborn had begun raiding the coast near Banefort. Each topic underscored the precariousness of Margaery's hold on the realm. She might sit the Iron Throne, but the kingdom was vast, and her roots of power must snake into every region if she hoped to endure. Over the subsequent weeks, Garland's correspondence from the west arrived in sporadic bursts. Jaime Lannister was apparently amenable to a negotiated peace. His biggest fear was that if he led the Westerlands into war, the Ironborn would exploit the chaos. But he also demanded that Cersei be released to him, that Tommen remain in his custody, and that House Lannister retain all its traditional rights. Margaery balked. She had no intention of relinquishing Tommen, who was too valuable a ward to lose. Nor would she allow Cersei, her bitterest foe, to roam free in the west, sowing potential rebellion. Negotiations ground on, with Garland delicately balancing polite refusals and renewed offers. Meanwhile, dispatches arrived from the north, each more confusing than the last. One raven claimed that Ramsay Bolton had been slain in a battle near Winterfell. that the Starks had reclaimed their ancestral seat. Another letter spoke of Jon Snow, once Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, now somehow king in the north. Yet a third source insisted that an army of wildlings had invaded, while creatures known as the Others stalked the snowy forests beyond the wall. Margaery did not know whom to believe. The maesters themselves seemed confounded. Whatever the truth, it confirmed that the North was on the cusp of a seismic change. At last, Margaery decided to dispatch a small, trusted envoy to Winterfell to learn the facts. She chose several of her bannermen from the Reach, men who had a reputation for level-headedness, along with a handful of skilled negotiators who had once served at the Citadel. If the North truly had a new Stark in power, they would approach him or her with offers of mutual respect. Tell them that the Tyrell crown recognizes the North's unique traditions, Margaery instructed. We need them to remain part of the realm. We can reaffirm their titles and promise them autonomy in local governance, so long as they acknowledge me as queen and pay their share of taxes. Lady Olenna tapped her cane. And if they refuse? Margaery set her jaw. We will see. Perhaps they have endured so much tragedy that they will welcome a less intrusive monarchy. But I refuse to yield the entire region. If House Stark or anyone else seeks outright independence, we will respond as needed. I do not relish war in the snows, but neither can I allow the kingdom to fracture. Thus the diplomatic mission set out for the north, while the rest of the realm buzzed with talk of the Iron Islands. News came that a new king of the Ironborn had emerged, Euron Greyjoy, who claimed to possess a fearsome fleet and an appetite for conquest. This Euron spoke of dragons, of wonders from the eastern seas, and of a plan to make the Iron Islands great again. The Tyrell regime found the idea of an Ironborn expansion deeply troubling, for the western coasts belonged to the Lannisters, a potential ally or adversary depending on how negotiations ended. If the Ironborn harried those shores, it might drive Jaime back into open conflict with the crown, or it might break the Lannisters entirely, leaving a vacuum. In either scenario, Margaery's fledgling monarchy could be destabilized. Late one night, Loras found himself pacing the ramparts of the Red Keep, gazing out at the dark waters of Blackwater Bay. The moon's reflection shimmered on the waves. The smell of salt and tar drifted from the harbor. He felt restless, his mind teeming with images of battles on the sea, Greyjoy raiders, Lannister armies massing in the west. He wondered if there would ever be a time when the realm could simply breathe in peace. As he turned, he spotted a cloaked figure standing near a crenellation, the shape outlined by moonlight. He approached warily, hand on the hilt of his sword, until he recognized one of Margaery's ladies-in-waiting, a young woman from a lesser branch of House Tyrell. She startled at his approach, turning to face him with wide eyes. "Ser Loras," she said, dipping into a belated curtsy. "I did not hear you." He relaxed his grip on his sword. "I apologize, my lady. I meant no alarm." He hesitated, uncertain why she was out here alone. "Are you well?" She mustered a small smile. "Yes, just enjoying the night air. It can be stifling indoors." Loras nodded. He understood that urge. At times, the corridors of the Red Keep felt like a maze of plotting and ambition. On these walls, at least one could see the sky. "Has the Queen retired?" he asked. "Yes, hours ago." She seemed weary from her day's audiences. The lady cast a glance at the lights of the city below. "The small folk speak highly of her, you know. They call her the Rose Queen, say she brings an end to famine. They pray she will not be as cruel as Joffrey was, nor as aloof as Tommen." She paused. "They speak of you, too." Loras tilted his head. "Oh, and what do they say?" "They call you the Kingslayer of sorts," she said with a faint laugh. "You killed Stannis, the man who claimed the crown. Some call you the Avenging Rose. Others whisper that you are cursed, that the blood you spilled will bring retribution." She lowered her gaze. "Forgive me, I only repeat what's said in the streets." He released a soft breath. "No forgiveness needed. I'm not surprised by gossip." He leaned against the cold stone of the rampart, looking out over the sleeping city. "The realm sees me as Margaery's champion, a killer of kings. Perhaps I am. But if that's what it takes to protect my family and ensure a measure of peace, so be it." The young lady studied him. "Do you regret it? Killing King Stannis?" Loras did not immediately answer. The memory flashed in his mind. The storm-lashed battlefield, the clash of steel, the hateful satisfaction he had felt as his blade pierced Stannis's armor. He had believed that avenging Renly would grant him some catharsis. And it had, in a way, yet it had also left a hollowness. At last he said softly, "No, I do not regret destroying him. Only the necessity of it." She nodded, her gaze empathetic. "You are not cursed, sire. At least, I do not believe so." A flicker of gratitude stirred in him. He inclined his head. "Thank you for saying so." They stood in companionable silence for a time, letting the wind rustle their cloaks. A single ship's lantern bobbed in the distance, someone crossing the bay, perhaps a late-night smuggler or fisherman. Loras found that the night's hush soothed him more than any raucous feast could. He wondered if Renly's spirit might be drifting somewhere in the sky, free of earthly crowns and mortal strife. At length, the lady turned and curtsied again. "I should retire. Good night, Sir Loras." He bowed politely, and as she departed, he stood alone with the wind. He thought of Margaery's suggestion that he might be wed off to secure alliances. The idea remained a leaden weight in his heart. He did not resent Margaery. He knew her intentions were for the good of the realm, but it underscored how different his life had become, no longer free to act solely on his own desires, bound by duty to the crown he had helped raise. Over the next fortnight, Margaery received increasingly worried reports about Euron Greyjoy's activities. The crowning of a new king on the Iron Islands was no rare occurrence, but Euron's arrogance and rumored cunning seemed to surpass that of his predecessors. He had sent ravens to major ports along the west coast, proclaiming himself a challenger to any who would deny the Ironborn their birthright as reavers of the sea. The messages were half threat, half boast, promising ruin if the lords of Westeros dared resist him. Jaime Lannister's response to these threats was uncertain. Garland's letters indicated that Jaime might actually consider an alliance with the crown to push back against the Ironborn. "If we unify, we can put an end to Euron's ambitions," Garland wrote. "But Jaime demands that you return Tommen to him as a sign of trust. He also insists that you release Cersei forthwith. He is adamant on this." Margaery read the letter with mounting frustration. She could not bring herself to release Cersei, not after the lengths to which the lioness had gone to torment and undermine her. Tommen was more negotiable, as the boy was no threat on his own, but was he worth giving up so valuable a hostage? She needed a show of good faith, yet the risk was enormous. She conferred with her council, receiving mixed advice. Some insisted that any alliance with the Lannisters was doomed by the inherent enmity between them. Others argued that the Lannisters still commanded enough resources to help hold off a major Ironborn assault. A single miscalculation could see the crown fighting on two fronts, one in the west against Euron, another in the north if the Starks declared independence. The tension was palpable. At the heart of this swirl of strategy, Margaery found herself increasingly reliant on Loras for moral support as much as martial might. She would summon him to her solar in the late evenings, and they would speak quietly of the burdens she faced, the rumors swirling, the potential outcomes of each decision. Loras, for his part, offered what counsel he could, yet he felt ill at ease giving political advice. The complexities of alliances and hostage exchanges weighed on him more heavily than the clarity of the battlefield. Finally, an ultimatum arrived from Jaime Lannister himself, written in a bold, decisive hand. He gave the Queen a month to come to terms, threatening that if she refused to release Cersei and return Tommen, he would close Lannisport to all trade from the Reach and fortify the Golden Tooth, effectively cutting off easy access from the west. He also implied that if Euron Greyjoy continued his raiding, he might negotiate separately with the Ironborn against the Tyrell crown. It was a desperate bluff, but a dangerous one. Jaime's concluding line burned in Margaery's thoughts. "I do this not for glory, but for family. Return what you have taken, or face a realm once more divided by war." Mace Tyrell sputtered in anger when he heard the letter read aloud in the council chamber. Lady Olenna cursed Jaime as a stubborn fool. Loras clenched his jaw, recalling every arrogant sneer Jaime had ever worn. Only Margaery sat in silence, her face betraying no emotion. At length, she spoke, voice calm but firm. "We will answer him, but we will not yield on Cersei. She is the true threat in his demands, not Tommen. If Jaime wants Tommen, I am willing to arrange a compromise. Perhaps Tommen can be sent to Casterly Rock under certain conditions that bar him from pressing any claim to the throne. That might satisfy Jaime's paternal instincts." Lord Caron frowned. "And if he insists on Cersei as well?" Margaery let out a quiet sigh. "Then we refuse. If it costs us an alliance, so be it. We cannot risk releasing that woman to roam free. She nearly destroyed King's Landing once. I won't allow her a second chance." The council murmured approval of her resolve. Lady Olenna nodded, apparently satisfied that Margaery would not buckle under pressure. Mace Tyrell insisted that they prepare for any eventuality, ordering more supplies from the Reach to bolster the city's granaries. Loras was tasked with intensifying the readiness of the Queensguard and reviewing the city's defenses. 3 days later, Margaery's official reply left King's Landing by Raven and by courier. She offered a narrow path for Jaime to receive Tommen, but refused to entertain the notion of releasing Cersei. She couched the refusal in terms of the safety of the realm, reminding Jaime how many enemies they faced outside the realm's borders. She pledged support if the Ironborn threatened Lannisport, promising the might of the Tyrell fleet to aid in its defense if, and only if, Jaime accepted the new order. With that letter dispatched, Margaery steeled herself to wait, knowing that Jaime's response could determine whether the West would stand with her or against her. Meanwhile, the quiet rumor of a Targaryen queen across the sea grew louder, as merchants from Essos trickled into the city with stories of a silver-haired woman commanding dragons in Meereen, forging alliances with Dothraki hordes. Thus far, she had not turned her gaze west, or so it seemed. But if she did, the realm would face a threat beyond any the Tyrells had yet encountered. Amid these storms of possibility, life in King's Landing took on an uneasy normalcy. The markets bustled, the common folk had food, and violence in the streets ebbed. Plays were performed in the squares, praising the Rose Queen's beauty and generosity. Some whispered that Margaery was even more beloved than she had been as Joffrey's bride, for she now had actual power to back her kindness. Yet seeds of discontent remained. Old Lannister loyalists met in secret, hoping for Jaime's triumphant return. Others muttered that the throne should have passed to Tommen or Myrcella if the rumors of incest were false. The faith militant watched the queen with hawkish eyes, still uncertain about her stance on their rearmament. In the Red Keep, Loras continued his dual existence as both a symbol and a man. He wore the ornate armor of the Queensguard, patrolled the corridors and throne room, listened to petitioners who sought the queen's ear, and occasionally broke up petty squabbles among courtiers. By night, he would wander the gardens or stand watch on the ramparts, haunted by memories of Renly. He had no illusions that his vow to protect Margaery would be the end of his trials. Each day brought new rumors, new signs of the realm's fragility. One late afternoon, as the sun cast golden light across the Red Keep's walls, a horn sounded at the city gates. Word reached Margaery that visitors from Dorne had arrived, none other than Prince Trystane Martell and one of his elder cousins, Obella Sand, who had been sent as envoys. The Martells had not been intimately involved in the War of Five Kings after the death of Prince Oberyn, but they had cause to loathe both the Lannisters and, by association, anyone who had once allied with them. Their arrival now suggested they were open to forging new alliances under the Tyrell regime, especially if it meant weakening the Lannisters' position further. The Dornish party was escorted to the Red Keep with all due ceremony. Margaery greeted them in the throne room, seated upon the Iron Throne, her posture regal yet welcoming. Trystane Martell, still a young man, bowed graciously, and Obella Sand, tall and proud, offered a curtsy that was more a measured dip of her head. Margaery bid them welcome, praising Dorne's beauty and Prince Doran's wisdom. The Dornish, in turn, congratulated her on her coronation, remarking how the realm needed a gentle but firm hand, an overt dig at the harshness of the previous Lannister-led court. After pleasantries, the Dornish envoys were shown to lavish apartments within the Red Keep. Loras, as Lord Commander, accompanied them to ensure their safety. He caught snippets of their conversation in the corridors. "It's not as grand as Sunspear," Obella said with a wry smile, glancing around at the tapestries. "But it will do." Trystane sniffed. "Nothing compares to Dorne. Yet we must see if the new queen truly treats us with the respect we deserve. She will want our cooperation, no doubt. Let us see what she offers." When they reached their chambers, Loras gave a polite bow and excused himself, leaving them to settle in. He wondered what demands Dorne might bring to the table. Surely, they would want vengeance for Oberyn Martell's death, which had occurred during Tyrion Lannister's trial by combat. With Tyrion gone and the Lannisters weakened, the Martells might see an advantage in supporting the Tyrell crown. But they might also expect grand concessions, perhaps a promise of autonomy in Dorne, or marriage alliances to tie them to the new royal line. That evening, a small feast was held in honor of the Dornish delegation. Margaery presided at the high table in the Great Hall, with Trystane Martell on her right and Obella Sand on her left. Loras stood at Margaery's back, fulfilling his Queen's Guard duty. The scent of roasted lamb and spiced wine filled the air as minstrels played lively tunes. Lady Olenna, seated nearby, cast shrewd glances at the Dornish visitors, gauging their mood and intentions. Mace Tyrell engaged Trystane in loud, amiable conversation about the wonders of Old Town and the bounty of the Reach. At one point, Obella Sand leaned past Margaery to address Loras, her dark eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Ser Loras, the famed Knight of Flowers, you have quite the reputation, or so we hear in Dorne. Slayer of Stannis, champion of many tourneys, and now protector of a queen." Loras inclined his head, wearing a polite smile. "I serve my queen, my lady. The tales often grow in the telling." Her lips curved. "Perhaps, but I suspect there is truth in them as well. My father used to say that only a few knights in the realm could match the legendary prowess of Oberyn Martell, and your name was always among them." He felt a stab of sadness, remembering Oberyn's flamboyant skill and the tragedy of his death. "Prince Oberyn was a warrior unlike any other," Loras replied. "His memory endures." Obella nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "That it does. Perhaps one day we might spar, Ser Loras? A friendly demonstration, to honor the memory of all we've lost." Margaery, overhearing, placed a graceful hand on Obella's wrist. "Let us not dwell on losses, Lady Obella. The future beckons us to unity." She smiled, though Loras sensed an undercurrent of tension. Indeed, these two women were feeling each other out. Obella sank back, her grin turning wry. "Of course, Your Grace. Unity is what brings us to your court. Dorne seeks a lasting peace. We have our own reasons to distrust Lannisters." Margaery inclined her head. "Then we shall talk of alliances, of how we might stand together against those who would threaten us. Euron Greyjoy, for instance, or those who might still cling to the old regime." Trystane Martell, who had been listening quietly, spoke with a gentle seriousness. "Yes, Your Grace. Dorne does not forget the past, yet we look to the future. My father sends his regards and hopes you will be amenable to certain rearrangements of the old treaties, especially regarding trade tariffs and the stationing of royal troops in the Dornish marches." Margaery smiled, raising her glass. "We are open to negotiation, Prince Trystane. I propose that tomorrow we meet in private, with only our closest advisors present, to discuss these matters in detail. Tonight is for feasting and friendship." They toasted, the crowd around them cheering the display of camaraderie. The feast progressed with jesters and dancing, the clash of cymbals and the swirl of brightly colored Dornish silks. Yet behind every smile, Loras sensed the careful maneuvering, the unspoken demands, the weight of what each region wanted. He saw the flicker of ambition in Obella Sand's eyes, the cautious optimism in Trystane's young features. This was how the realm was knitted together, not by swords alone, but by words and bargains made over cups of wine. After the feast, while the hall emptied, Loras remained a while on the dais to oversee the safe departure of the queen and the Dornish guests. He observed Lady Olenna and Margaery exchanging a few hushed words, presumably about the next day's negotiations. He felt a pang of sympathy for his sister, who must juggle these alliances while fending off threats from the west and the north. Only when the hall was nearly deserted did Loras finally step away, longing for the quiet of his chambers. On his way out, he paused by a brazier where the last tongues of flame licked at the embers, warming his hands. In that moment, he thought of the future that might unfold. If Margaery secured Dorne, pacified the west, and found a way to reconcile the north, she might truly unite the 7 kingdoms under her banner. But what of the rumors from across the narrow sea? What if dragons returned to Westeros, bearing a Targaryen queen with a claim older than any Baratheon or Tyrell could boast? He closed his eyes, feeling the heat of the brazier against his palms. Would he face dragons one day? Would he find himself, once again, forced to kill a monarch for the sake of his family's rule? The thought made his stomach churn. For all his skill, Loras was beginning to understand that no amount of swordsmanship could quell the shifting alliances and ancient claims that threatened the realm. War might come again, no matter how many careful treaties they signed. Pushing aside his worries, he withdrew from the Great Hall, heading for the corridor that led to the Queen's Guard barracks. The echo of his boots on the stone floors reminded him of how far he had come from those days when he was simply the Knight of Flowers, winning tourneys for Renly's favor. He still carried that man somewhere within, though his edges had been honed to a deadly blade. In his chambers, he removed his armor, letting it rest on a wooden stand. He caught sight of his reflection in the polished metal, a face both familiar and changed, the hollows beneath his eyes more pronounced, the corners of his mouth tugged down by burdens. Setting aside the notion of peace for just a moment, he allowed himself to remember Renly's laughter, the bright, unburdened sound of a man who once dared to dream of a gentler kingdom. If Margaery's rule could one day bring that gentleness back to Westeros, perhaps his toils would be worth it. Perhaps all the subterfuge, the deals, and the marriages would lead to a realm where, for a fleeting moment, the common folk might celebrate love, bread, and roses more than war. But that day had not yet arrived. For the present, he was Loras Tyrell, the Avenging Rose, sworn to uphold his sister's crown by any means. The realm might break beneath them or it might blossom. Either way, he would see it through to the end. When dawn came, he prepared himself anew, donning fresh armor and striding out to face another day of negotiations, uncertain tidings, and the delicate dance of power that had become his life. If the storm still brewed on every horizon, north, west, sea, and sky, then the Tyrell monarchy would have to stand, a bastion of green and gold amidst the gathering darkness. And Loras Tyrell would be at the forefront, sword in hand, heart steeled against both regret and fear, ready to carve a path toward whatever fate might hold for the Rose Queen and the kingdom she now claimed as her own.